Tierney, if you'd like to go ahead and start the recording, that would be great.
Recording started.
Thank you very much. We do record so that we can keep these meetings on our website for future reference and to kind of guide us moving forward, and for people who weren't able to attend today. So I want to let everyone know that we have had a few group members leave the group, and that's partially because we had people from all over the country, and sometimes trying to adjust to time changes and academic schedules and so forth made it difficult to participate. So we do have about 3 openings, and I'll be going back to our original recruitment and then sending out another recruitment for new members to join us moving forward. Even though after today's meeting, we only have 2 more meetings scheduled for the rest of the year. And we'll have to have a discussion about whether or not we want to resume our work moving forward. So I just want to let everyone know about that. So with that, we'll go ahead and take roll. And it looks like I'm just going to call off names. Chris Beecher, I know you're here, right?
Yep.
All right. Richard Sams, did we get your microphone concern taken care of? I'm not sure. I know you're here, but I know we were having technical difficulties. And it looks like we still may be, so we'll continue to work on that. But Richard, you are here. Taylor Carter, I know you're here, right?
Yes, I'm
All
here.
right. Great, thank you. Tracy Klein was excused. Ryan McLaughlin, I don't see him today. Doesn't look like Sarah Murphy. Did you join us? Not seeing you either. I know Brad Douglas was on the road and was going to try to call in. Do we have anyone who's called in that we can see?
There are no call-in, just online attendees.
Okay, thank you, Tierney. David Gang, not here. Jessica, you are here. Holly Moody, I do not see. Angie Peck from Liquor and Cannabis Board, are you with us here today?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, thank you. Board Member Vollendroff is not online. Did Nick Pullman join us this morning? No.
He is not signed in to be in this meeting. There was no response from the invitation from him.
Okay, thank you. And then also I know Justin, I think I saw you on as well, correct?
Yes, I'm present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next item is approval of our last meeting minutes. I think everyone had an opportunity to review those. Any additional changes before we move forward into our discussion topics today? All right, we'll go ahead and finalize those and get those up on the website. So this morning we wanted to report out on our first 2 subgroups that met in July to talk about 2 things: detectable levels of THC and future standards. And then the second subgroup was discussing cannabis product safety. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of what we accomplished, or the things that we talked about. First, with respect to detectable levels of THC and future standards. We met on July 12th. Members in attendance in that particular subgroup were Jessica, Brad, Richard, Holly, Chris, and Taylor and Sarah were alternates. I don't believe they attended those meetings. But we discussed a couple things. First was survey the private labs to talk about instrumentations. And we believe that results of that survey could help us separate theory from what is reliably possible in Washington in terms of determining detectable limits. And it may also help us better understand the limits of technology and help us more work towards safety standards. And then we also wanted to begin to create buckets or a matrix of product types that may help us begin to unpack units of detection by product types. And I'll stop right there and let the group members kind of chime in and maybe have some additional discussion.
Kathy, I think that summarizes it pretty well. I mean, I think that different technology has different limits, and we have a strong indication that most labs here in the state will probably be HPLC UV. We went over some of the paperwork that ASTM and others have put out on what they think should be theoretical standards. And I think the goal was, let's confirm our theory of what technology people are using, and then begin to divide out based upon matrix and volume, what we actually believe may be detectable levels. So for example, a larger volume beverage may have a different detectable level than a smaller edible, just based upon the limitations of technology, and to really kind of begin to define what we believe labs should be able to detect, is, I think, what we discussed.
Right, and Chris, go ahead, Chris.
I agree that the minutes basically do they're correct. I do have a feeling that we really need to define what the need is before we define the equipment. I think it would be a mistake to define uh, to limit what you can see by limiting the technology. And I really think we need to just figure out what we want to see, what you need to see, and how you need to see it. And I believe that there may be two levels of that. I think that in chemistry and industrial levels, most of the pure materials that come in are tested and are characterized, and then the final products are characterized. And I think that maybe the simplest way around it would be to suggest that you really need to test the material that is used in making the products separately than the products in a more complex matrix. And it may be that the products in a more complex matrix, they really don't need the same level of scrutiny that the raw material does. But I think there are too many industrial accidents where the material is that's used in a product is contaminated or is and I mean, along these lines we test for pesticides, and I think the correct place to test for many of these things would be a more detailed test that probably occurred before the material was inserted into a product, before it was used, some sort of a certification. And again, as a chemist, I think virtually every product I buy has a cheat sheet on it that tells me, what it is, and it's what it's been tested for. And so I think that we really need to figure out what we need to see and when we need to see it. And that may not be a one-time look that sees and does everything.
Anyone else in the group have a response for Chris?
I think that as a little bit of a backdrop on that, there was a fair amount of discussion that went on this in the Hemp and Food Safety Task Force, and I'd have to go and pull my notes. And I think the concern with testing potentially upstream, which is an idea that I personally like, but the concern with that, I think, was spot checking downstream. And so how you correlate those, and the thought that maybe not all products would be manufactured in Washington. And so just really trying to figure out how a GMP type process would flow through that. I think that there were some concerns with other groups, and we can go back and look through the notes on whether or not just testing midstream would be feasible.
I understand that, but it may be that one of the restrictions to sell in the state would be that the material would have to be certified to some level in order to simplify the products made within the state. And on some level, it favors local producers. So I would think that the state would find that somewhat attractive.
I did. Chris and I were talking about this before we started the meeting this morning, and that the testing standards in Washington State for cannabis originally had almost a two-gated system where we did test the plant matter before it was turned into, or inserted into an edible or became a concentrate or something like that. And in this last set of rule changes that were made to the cannabis product testing standards, we removed that first level. So what really we were concerned in testing or making sure was fully tested was the product that hit the shelves for the consumer. So that gave a little more flexibility to producers and processors, and also, helped to sort of mitigate cost that became part of product testing in Washington when we made pesticide testing mandatory. So just something else to consider in the conversation. And that would be, the impact to the industry when additional testing is required. Yeah.
It would seem to me that it would be faster, cheaper, and easier to do a batch certification of the year's produce up front and certify that batch and then distribute it, and then that it's you don't have to find the low abundance materials in the final product, because finding them in something Jessica, as you say, a dilute solution is going to be far more difficult than, I mean, sure, you can analyze 10 mils concentrated onto half a mil, but the reality is, if you were to do a certification of the material, then the certification on the product becomes much faster and easier, and you don't need to have as much rigor on the certification of the product because the material is already certified. You're just verifying that concentrations are what you expect, and that they're meeting the profile. But the safety of the material that's used, the pesticides, the concentrations of the cannabinoids, the appropriateness of the cannabinoid distributions, can all be done as part of the certification.
And I think one of the concerns that, and when I'm thinking back to the other work group that came up, was just essentially mixing and formulation. So essentially, how do we, I don't know if we can get away from that in-level testing. We may be able to, but the reality is mixing these products is one of the concerns. Like adequately getting cannabinoids mixed into a solution. Let's say, for example, a large beverage batch or something. You may have certain cans, if you're not in testing, people might not be as efficient with emulsions or things like that. And so that was one of the concerns that came up. I think it's, definitely worth reevaluating, but it was something that was debated pretty heavily in the last work group on whether.
I think what I'm hearing from you is that there's a larger number of batches in the product lines currently, as opposed to, and so there would be more small batches that would need to be tested. And I think I'm coming from a more industrial background, where I would think that what you would want to do is to, sort of pool stuff together so that the testing was done in fairly large batches where you could have consistency and more reproducibility as a function of time.
I think that the discussion before was, let's say, for example, somebody gets some crude oil or something like that, or
Right.
distillate, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is.
Mm-hmm.
That distillate could end up in a number of products downstream. And
Mm-hmm.
so let's say, for example, that that distillate was tested and it passed. I think that there was a lot of people that said, hey, that would be a good enough standard. But then there was a lot of discussion on if that distillate was used to make chocolates and a bar and soda, or whatever it was. We need also, like, it's really making sure that there's the right amount in the product that the consumer purchases.
Absolutely.
And so there was some concern that essentially what we would be doing is setting up a two-tiered testing system versus
Mm-hmm.
a single-tiered testing system, because there was not necessarily, and maybe things have changed. It's definitely worth bringing up and having the discussion within
Discussion.
on whether or not we believe the manufacturing is as consistent as it may be, in manufacturing, treetop apple juice or something, where you test the upstream and then it's diluted out downstream, where this may be a slightly different situation. There was a lot of um, desire to do essentially the ingredient testing, but a lot of pushback. And I think we need to go back and look through the notes on where that pushback came from on not doing finished product testing.
I'm not saying not to do finished product testing. I actually think finished product testing is is critically important. But I'm saying that finished product testing may require that you only verify that the THC levels are as expected, are within, you know, predefined limits in the final product, whereas right now you may be obligated to test for a much larger number of things if you only have a single level. If in the final product if the material is certified and you know the levels of the various cannabinoids that are relevant, then you can test the final product to make sure that one or more of them, because the material is certified, they're all going to act in concert, are at the levels that you expect, and it becomes a rather straightforward test and is in fact of great benefit to the public. The product is always going to be reproducible, but I don't think that you want the raw materials to be tested at a fairly cursory level. I think you want a reasonably deep analysis of the pesticides, of the metal possible contaminants. And I think at this point, because the cannabinoids, the semi-synthetics are creeping in at such a level. I mean, and they're minor modifications of natural plants. I really think it serves the public, and I think it serves the LCB to analyze the material that is used as starting material and and certify it for quality that it can be used as a starting material. Otherwise you have mom and pop shops that are basically going out into the field and grabbing, their own plants and popping it into a brownie, selling it in the farmer's market, and who knows?
Well, and I think that the discussion before was separating out like the pesticide and heavy metal and allowing that to be preferentially done at an ingredient level as a single test, but the cannabinoid level actually having to be done in the at the finished goods is, I think, how things ended up.
I can see. I think that is the reality as it sits now. But I think that the cannabinoids really could and should be done up at the top, just because the products that are coming down now. I'm in North Carolina where it is not yet legal, and yet there are stores that are selling completely hallucinogenic products that are within the law. And I find that to be somewhat horrifying. And I think there are so many things coming in these days. I mean, these are, you shift a double bond and you've got a compound that is not regulated. The reality is that it would not be a bad idea to control the product so that the starting materials were verified safe and of a good quality level. And it may be the technology has just changed. This chemistry, I don't know. I don't think it existed 10 years ago, on the commercial scale that it is now.
And I think the concern was in the broad definition of that, like manufacturing with an ingredient, that our concern was the final product not contain the cannabinoids of concern, and that bringing in the ingredient did not necessarily mean that people could not manufacture and have a finished product with a cannabinoid of concern. And that's why heavy metals and pesticides and things could be done at a more concentrated level, but downstream potentially doing the cannabinoid needed to be done in the product that ended up in the consumer's hands.
So I kind of like to steer the conversation back to some of the things that we were talking about with respect to surveying labs, if I could. Although I want to just pause for a minute and reach out to anyone else on the work group or anyone from LCB who has a question or a comment that they'd like to offer at this point in the conversation. I do know we have some technical difficulties. I was going to say, Richard, if you want to send me an email with anything that you're thinking, I'm happy to read it to the group, or a text message. But Justin, Angie, anything to offer anyone from the group?
Not right now, thanks.
Okay, sure. Um, uh, if we could do something for the folks listening in, Jessica, you were talking about HPLC, UV, those kinds of things. Can you give a brief description for folks who may not know what those acronyms stand for?
I guess at a high level, there's different technology people can use to detect cannabinoids. And probably the most common and probably the only platform, it may not be, but definitely I would think the overwhelming platform in the state that's used is high pressure liquid chromatography with a UV light detection on the back end. And it's kind of been the gold standard that we've built our cannabinoid safety levels around in the state. And it's probably, I mean, it's worth surveying, and I think we have the 8 labs, what they use, but the labs that I know are using it. And so the thought is we really should, when we think about our discussions around this, I think it's fair to say that the testing will be done most likely in those labs, and we should facilitate based upon the gold standard technology that they're utilizing.
Right, and I think that I go back to the conversation and think about what we're trying to do is determine by product type what the limit of detection might be, right? Okay. All right. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
In North Carolina, the state lab uses mass spec, and it does have greater sensitivity and greater specificity. However, it is a much more expensive piece of equipment. There is no question about it. The LCUV is a great piece of equipment, but I would guess that most of the UV bands for most of the cannabinoids are pretty similar. They will all have absorption in the same range. And so if your chromatography is off, and I think the reason the state here has required the mass spec is actually to get that higher level of detail. I actually think that you're correct. LCUV would be fine if you're really verifying that a product is not it doesn't contain twice as much as you think. But I don't know that it. I don't know if I'm a mass spectroscopist myself, so I love mass spec. What can I say? And it is a much higher level of detail and a much more sensitive piece of equipment. And the modern techniques, and this is where I say, seems to me that looking at the ingredients in a higher level, and then verifying that the product as it goes out is what you expect it to be, is sort of in the interest. But I don't know that all labs need to run a mass spec, but I think at some point you're gonna the pesticides are done on a mass spec, but you
Yeah.
don't have that much sensitivity in UV for the pesticides. That's why they were split out earlier.
And I think turning, if I could for a minute, turn back to the question about levels of limits of detection. The other thing I think the group didn't really touch on, and maybe we should think about that, is other labs that will be testing. And so we're going to have the Washington State Patrol lab that will also be testing, likely, and WSDA as well. So I think we can create a survey that will go to our independent labs, our certified labs, but also just kind of bear in mind that there are two other entities that will likely be performing limits of detection as well when we think about standards.
But I do believe that it's extremely important that we enable a system that commercial companies can get an answer that they can rely on. And if we look back at the bill, if I remember right, the mass specs got actually cut from our patrol lab. So I think it's really important for us to understand, how do our commercial labs compare, and how do we enable actually a system that commercial companies can have security in their testing results.
Right.
Do
you know why the mass specs were cut?
Pricing, budget, I believe, Kathy.
I'm sure it is budget, but
yeah.
Yeah, it but it's the sensitivity and the specificity are orders of magnitude higher.
Justin has his hand raised. Please, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, as the discussion unfolds and exploration occurs, I think we're looking at two things. I mean, one, from Washington State, of course, we have the issue that was left in the bill on, it's not requiring the liquid chromatography equipment, and so we need to figure out how the standard is going to work within Washington for the private labs and the state labs. But I think overall, it's really important, as we're looking at this from a broader scale, we also consider what is the best practice. And so kind of what has been discussed here on, this is the best equipment, this is the best way to evaluate these particular levels. And I think we need to recognize what is the best practice, and then what are we doing within our state to work around what the current statutory language says. And so I think it's a little bit twofold for us. And so I don't want to deter the conversation around what would be the best practice, because we may be limited based on current statutory language, but I think it would be really wise to recognize that best practice. So I just wanted to throw that out and not discourage any conversation towards that end.
Thank you for that, Justin.
So is there some sort of central agency for like checking almost like a spike sample across all these labs, like across the state and the commercial, basically like a central agency to have one person with a set level of spike sample to test all of them, or not really?
Taylor, in Washington, we're in the process of kind of migrating that situation, and I think that there'll be a little bit more ring testing type protocols in the future, but we are in the process of doing a multi-year kind of transition on that.
You know, the FDA does sends out a sample on a regular basis. I think they're now up to the 4th or 5th sample they send out, and it is a sample that they have certified, and they send it to any lab that requests it. And it would seem that it might not be a bad idea to participate in the FDA program and make it even sort of a qualification that you participate. If you want to prove that you are in fact doing the job, and I think everybody is doing the job. But that is a standard sample that they will push out. Um, at at this point, they've been doing it at least once or twice a year for the last few years.
And I think that there's a lab subgroup that's had a lot of discussions around this, and I think there's been a lot of debate about whether you use ASTM standards, the FDA standards, different standards in different matrices. So my understanding is that that is part of a separate subgroup that is being rolled out here. I think there was a meeting yesterday on it. I didn't make, but on as part of the certification here.
Mhm.
All right. Excellent discussion. Any closing words before we move to the next subgroup topic?
We're done.
All right, doesn't look like it. All right, so the next subgroup, and this was the cannabis products. I'm going to read from my note. Cannabis product safety subgroup. We met on July 20th, and present there were Brad Douglas, Jessica Tanani, Taylor, David Gang was there as well. And I believe, Taylor, were you there as well? Okay, yes, all right. And we discussed different product types. And then we talked about different product standards. And then we talked about production standards. So extraction, types of extraction, what that meant. We discussed consumption concerns versus environmental concerns as they relate to production. We also discussed remediation and food safety. And so one thing that Brad Douglas really underscored, and I know he's not able to join us right now because I believe he's traveling, he underscored and really wanted the group to increase our understanding related to total exposure. So carefully translate what this might mean in our recommendations or options that we offer into the future. And he talked about orders of magnitude in the difference that occurs back to the concentration of the contaminant that's in the product. So we had a really robust discussion, a really great debate. I think Jessica alluded to that. Open the floor for members of that group to share additional thinking or add additional thoughts that I didn't cover in that synopsis. So Taylor, if you want to jump on, join us if you wish, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like you covered a lot of it very well. It's unfortunate he's not here to go over some of the stuff that he had covered, but I think the progress that was kind of started in that group was very efficient. I mean, again, I think there's still some stuff to go on it, but I do feel like a lot of good progress was made during that meeting.
Yeah, Jessica.
I agree. And I think that there was a lot of discussion about that, all extraction is not the same extraction. And there may be standards within the state that we allow certain forms of remediation. And that potentially we need to really look at exposure very differently from like an inhaled product perspective versus 10 milligram consumption. And that those may be, different scenarios, and we just need to break out the product classes and figure out what may be possible or what is definitely not possible.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to offer for folks who may not have joined us in previous meetings is the group identified, the larger group identified 4 or 5 different areas of interest that they wanted to explore this year. And those areas of interest aligned with what the board was interested in as well. So we were able to sort of rate those interest areas in terms of how much interest there was. And the things that we're talking about here within these subgroups were the two top areas of interest. So that's why they're a little bit different, but there are some similarities, and that we're creating sort of these buckets, if you will, to sort our thinking out and help inform our recommendations and the options that we offer moving forward. For this particular group, I did start creating the buckets, if you will. And one thing that was sort of interesting to me as I started to unpack the discussion and creating a product, or I'm sorry, a product standard bucket and a production standard bucket, is I think the group needs to spend some time defining what a product standard means and what a production standard means, because those aren't necessarily clear, I think, and they sort of cross over into each other. So if we're going to make those distinct, I think we might want to spend some time unpacking that a little more as well. And then looking at existing rule, and the document that I shared with that group, and I think it was just earlier this week, is also trying to align what's in existing rule and statute with what our thinking is around product standards and production standards, and where we might need to make some revisions, or where we can align our thinking with what's already in rule and statute. So I'll stop there and let others speak as well.
I think you did a good job of summarizing it. And I think that our goal is really to start working on that table that you sent out, and, having more active discussion around it and filling it out.
Right. And Taylor, I think you're the only other person from that work group here. Anything else to add? I think you had some really great contributions to that debate. It was great.
Yeah, I just agree that I think with more discussion we can kind of narrow it down. I'm always in literature about, the cannabinoids and stuff, and just kind of more recently in some of the liver byproducts, like what it's kind of breaking down into, and just a lot of the stuff with the body. So yeah, I think any of those discussions, I think there's more to definitely be had with the consumption route, and just kind of maybe where some of the standard levels need to be based on like a toxicology level of some
Yes.
routes may have potentially more harm down the line than others. So you may need to be way more precise in your measurement of some of these potential byproducts. But again, I think the discussion in that group's, moving in a very good direction. So.
All right, checking in with anyone from LCB wishes to contribute to the conversation. And we haven't, I think I was the lone person from LCB in that discussion, but that's okay. Okay. All right. So if nothing further, as I predicted, I thought this would be a shorter meeting today than some of our meetings in the past. And I do hope that our October meeting will use the entire hour and a half, because I do believe that we will have documents that we can share broadly with the group and with the public, that contain some recommendations that have built out some of these buckets that we've been discussing more broadly. Those documents will be in draft form for sure. But I think we're coming to the close of the sort of estimated lifespan of this work group, I think we're making great progress in providing some deliverables. So with that said, we can close the meeting about 45 minutes early, but I do want to offer a couple things in closing. With respect to the subgroups, we are going to have at least 3 more subgroup meetings. So those will occur in later this month throughout September, so that we can have some really robust content to offer in October for our cannabinoid science work group meeting. And ultimately that is the goal of this work group, to provide some some guidance, at least some recommendations to decision makers moving forward. And we do want to be able to support the work in determining detectable levels that several agencies are working on, I would say. Anything else in closing that anyone else would like to offer? I'd like to hand it over to Justin if there's anything else you'd like to offer before we close as well.
Yeah, just thank you everybody for your continued participation. I think this is really important for us to get our minds around, so we can be productive moving forward and looking at these standards, particularly when we're looking at some of the national interest right now with the Farm Bill, and what is that going to look like? FDA is looking for feedback right now, and so I think this is really a group that can inform some of those conversations as well to make sure that multiple states are moving in the right direction. So thank you all for continued participation in this, and we really appreciate your input.
Thanks, Justin. All right, and with that, happy to give you 45 minutes back in your day. Thanks very much for joining us today, and we will see you in October. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.